If you had this on your plate during the Great Depression, it wasn't a sign of good eating. It was a sign you were struggling to survive. With money tight and food scarce, families had to get creative, turning the cheapest, oddest, and sometimes downright unappetizing ingredients into dinner. One of the most overlooked foods that quietly marked hardship during the Great Depression was the curiously named Milkorno, a rather peculiar-sounding mixture dreamed up by food scientists to battle widespread hunger. Composed primarily of cornmeal and powdered milk, Milkorno wasn't exactly something folks would crave, yet its affordability and accessibility made it indispensable when pennies counted. Distributed by relief agencies and marketed aggressively by the government, Milkorno's charm lay in its extreme economy, enabling households to feed entire families for mere cents a serving. Born entirely from the necessity of doing more with less, this dish showcased genuine American creativity, though diners jokingly remarked you needed plenty of imagination to enjoy it. Nonetheless, Milkorno cleverly maximized nutritional value, combining inexpensive ingredients to create something filling, nutritious, and relatively palatable. Remarkably versatile, it could appear as porridge, gruel, or fried patties, each meal subtly different, though perhaps equally uninspiring. Families even stirred in leftover scraps or bits of syrup and honey, demonstrating impressive resourcefulness while reducing waste. In a time when fruit was considered an expensive luxury rather than an everyday ingredient, resourceful home cooks turned to an unlikely alternative: vinegar pie. If you're wondering why anyone would voluntarily bake vinegar into a dessert, the answer lies in the ingenious Depression-era philosophy of maximizing resources. Invented when traditional pie fillings like apples or berries became unaffordable, cooks creatively combined pantry staples such as vinegar, sugar, and eggs to mimic the familiar tartness of fruit. With vinegar abundant and incredibly affordable, this pie quickly became a common sight on American dinner tables. In fact, recipes often varied by region, showcasing household creativity, from delicate spiced custard versions in the South to simpler, sweeter recipes up north. Families further reduced waste by utilizing leftover pastry dough scraps, ensuring nothing edible ever went unused. Interestingly, this pie's tangy flavor resembled lemon meringue closely enough to fool unsuspecting diners, at least until someone spilled the secret ingredient. It's fair to say vinegar pie wouldn't win any popularity contest today, yet back then it symbolized determination to maintain normalcy despite limited means. When fresh apples were priced like luxury goods during the Great Depression, innovative cooks cleverly turned soda crackers into an impressive substitute, giving birth to the famous mock apple pie, affectionately called cracker pie. It might seem peculiar that crackers could convincingly imitate juicy apples, but desperate times called for ingenious solutions. Accessibility was key. Soda crackers were inexpensive and widely available, perfect for frugal families trying to stretch their budget. By simmering these crackers with sugar, cinnamon, and lemon juice, ingredients readily found in most pantries, cooks crafted a dessert so deceptively delicious, people often failed to notice it didn't contain a single slice of fruit. A popular recipe printed on Ritz cracker boxes even helped spread its popularity nationwide, though some folks jokingly said it required the taste buds of someone who'd never actually eaten apples. The pie was more than just a curious kitchen trick. It embodied the Depression-era ethos of reducing waste by creatively repurposing simple ingredients, turning basic crackers into comfort food. When milk and eggs became pantry luxuries out of reach for most American families, frugal cooks responded by concocting an economical yet humble dessert known as poor man's rice pudding. Made simply with rice, water, and a pinch of sweetener, this pared-down recipe showcased Depression-era ingenuity at its finest. Rice was affordable, widely available, and especially useful since it expanded significantly when cooked, allowing households to feed several mouths from a single scoop. Though traditional rice pudding relied heavily on milk and eggs to achieve its creamy consistency, this resourceful version creatively compensated by slow-cooking rice in extra water, gently coaxing out starch to mimic creaminess. Its minimal sweetness came courtesy of a cautious spoonful of sugar or molasses, just enough to briefly fool taste buds into thinking dessert had arrived. Many cooks added subtle flavors like cinnamon, nutmeg, or even leftover fruit peels, expertly maximizing resources by repurposing kitchen scraps. Granted, the result wasn't exactly award-winning. Some Depression-era children jokingly dubbed it sweetened wallpaper paste, but it filled empty stomachs without emptying wallets. Few dishes symbolize Depression-era hardship quite like the infamous Lard Sandwich, a meal proudly claimed by almost no one yet widely consumed when pantries ran bare. While today a sandwich generally implies meat, cheese, or at least peanut butter, back then spreading plain pork fat between slices of stale bread constituted a legitimate midday meal. Lard sandwiches were undeniably affordable and accessible, especially since leftover fat drippings from pork or bacon were routinely saved in household tins to prevent waste. An early form of recycling, you might say, long before it was trendy. These sandwiches exemplified creativity born from necessity. To add variety, some resourceful cooks seasoned them with salt, pepper, or occasionally sugar, pretending they'd upgraded the dish into a gourmet offering. Of course, the sandwich remained primarily a means of survival rather than culinary delight. Many who experienced it during childhood joked later that the taste lingered in their memories longer than they'd have liked. Yet, despite being less than desirable, these greasy staples provided essential calories when families had little else. In the era when dinner had to stretch further than paychecks ever could, savvy home cooks assembled an economical masterpiece known as Depression-era Bologna casserole. The dish itself featured modest ingredients: thinly sliced cheap Bologna, potatoes, and plenty of gravy, items affordable enough to reliably fill hungry stomachs. Bologna was especially accessible due to its low price and widespread availability, earning it the nickname poor man's steak, though few people probably boasted about serving steak straight from a deli wrapper. Resourceful homemakers layered the processed meat with sliced potatoes, often salvaged from previous meals to avoid any waste, smothering the concoction in thick gravy made from kitchen drippings. It wasn't haute cuisine, but it demonstrated creativity born directly from necessity, transforming sparse ingredients into something resembling comfort food. One humorous tale from Depression-era kitchens suggested the best thing about the casserole was that it tasted slightly better reheated the next day, though cynics might argue anything smothered in gravy has nowhere to go but up. Regardless, this casserole proved that even limited ingredients could be rearranged cleverly enough to provide nourishing meals for struggling families. Baking a delicious cake without eggs or butter might seem like a culinary contradiction, yet during the Great Depression, it became a staple in countless American kitchens. Dubbed Eggless Butterless cake, this clever confection relied solely on affordability and accessibility, as basic pantry essentials vanished from store shelves or skyrocketed in price. Households mastered the chemistry of scarcity, substituting eggs and butter with pantry-friendly alternatives like vinegar and baking soda, ingredients that were cheap and always accessible, magically turning batter airy and tender. Interestingly, cooks relied heavily on vinegar's acidic reaction with baking soda to mimic the rising power of pricier ingredients. Some even seasoned the dessert generously with spices like cinnamon or cloves, enhancing flavor without additional cost. Although it lacked the rich, buttery taste Americans traditionally associated with cake, it still provided families with a satisfying dessert. Proof positive that desperation could drive genuine culinary innovation. Homemakers humorously claimed you could hardly miss ingredients you hadn't tasted in months. For those who thought they'd squeezed every possible use from an ear of corn, the Great Depression introduced one more clever trick: corncob jelly. After corn kernels were painstakingly removed and eaten, the bare cobs, typically destined for the garbage bin or livestock feed, found new life simmering in pots of sugar water. This remarkable jelly was born from a need to stretch kitchen resources further, turning literal leftovers into a surprisingly tasty spread. It might seem strange today, but for families navigating poverty, wasting food was simply unthinkable. Corncob jelly's creation exemplified Depression-era creativity and resourcefulness, transforming discarded cobs into something sweetly reminiscent of honey or apple jelly, though admittedly it never won any culinary awards. Housewives seasoned it lightly with sugar, a pinch of citrus rind, or spices salvaged from pantry corners to boost flavor without increasing cost. Affordability was central. Cobs were plentiful and free, especially during harvest season when other staples were scarce. Remarkably, this jelly became a welcomed luxury during lean times, brightening otherwise bland meals while demonstrating that culinary ingenuity often thrives best under pressure. Imagine preparing a hearty meal from nearly nothing. Just water, maybe a few vegetable scraps, and plenty of optimism. Such was the humble reality behind water soup, also known by its legendary alias, stone soup. Families living through the Great Depression frequently faced empty cupboards, so recipes like these epitomized resourcefulness in the face of scarcity. Although the original European folktale joked about a stone turning water into a delicious soup, Depression-era American cooks knew the magic depended less on stones and more on creativity born from necessity. Leftover carrot peelings, onion skins, potato bits, anything edible that once might have landed in the compost heap found its way into this resourceful broth. Some jokingly called it the perfect zero-calorie diet, since calories were hardly abundant. Yet beneath the humor lay the sobering truth. Affordability and accessibility defined Depression-era menus, and water soup cost practically nothing. Interestingly, families sometimes stirred in wild greens, dandelions, or foraged herbs, infusing minimal nourishment into the otherwise tasteless liquid. In a poignant symbol of desperation, stones were occasionally boiled in the pot, inspiring the nickname stone soup from an old folktale, representing hope rather than actual flavor enhancement. When hard times stripped pantries bare, American kitchens echoed with a simple phrase, "Use it up or do without," which perfectly describes the ethos behind the creation of Mulligan Stew. Originating from community soup kitchens and hobo camps, this stew was named humorously after an imaginary chef called Mr. Mulligan, suggesting someone skilled in turning random scraps into culinary miracles. Essentially, it involved gathering leftover meats, scraps of vegetables, and whatever seasonings were affordable, then simmering them into a meal that felt substantial, even when its ingredients weren't. Affordability wasn't just the stew's benefit, it was its very identity. With no set recipe, cooks creatively utilized leftovers that otherwise might be tossed out, expertly maximizing resources during a time when wasting even a potato peel was unthinkable. Mulligan Stew varied dramatically from household to household, with some batches resembling a hearty vegetable medley, while others leaned heavily on potatoes or beans. Facing empty wallets and emptier pantries, Depression-era home cooks cleverly reinvented dinner using vegetables as meat substitutes, fooling taste buds and budgets alike. A prime example of this resourceful culinary illusion was the mock fish fillet, often called a mock fish fillet, despite containing not even a hint of seafood. Sliced eggplant, squash, or sometimes even humble potatoes were breaded, seasoned, and fried crisp, carefully mimicking the texture and appearance of real fish. Though genuine seafood remained financially inaccessible for struggling families inland, eggplants and squash grew abundantly and cheaply, making this inventive swap an economical lifesaver. Resourceful cooks further reduced waste by seasoning slices with leftover pickle juice or vinegar, ingeniously reproducing the tangy flavor of seafood without ever dipping a fishing pole into the water. Interestingly, old cookbooks frequently suggested serving these mock fillets with ketchup or homemade tartar sauce, often leaving diners playfully debating whether they tasted catch of the day or merely catch of the backyard. Cooking during the Great Depression meant stretching every ingredient to its imaginative limits, but pairing peanut butter with onions might have pushed imagination further than usual. Yet, that's precisely what happened with Depression-era peanut butter stuffed onions, a humble dish that took affordability to an entirely new level. Peanut butter was one of the rare foods still economically within reach, and onions were accessible, abundant, and lasted longer than most vegetables, which made them the perfect vessel for experimentation. Clever home cooks hollowed out onions, filled them generously with peanut butter mixed with stale breadcrumbs or cracker crumbs, then baked them until tender. Believe it or not, this unusual pairing wasn't purely a desperate measure. Peanut butter was actually promoted as a cheap source of protein during the Depression, marketed aggressively as an economical meat substitute. Reducing waste was key, so families carefully reused breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, ensuring nothing went uneaten or unappreciated, though perhaps taste buds weren't as appreciative as budgets. The savory-sweet combo raised eyebrows and occasionally laughter, as children joked it tasted like a sandwich gone terribly wrong. In many Depression-era households, stale bread wasn't simply tossed, it was treasured. Thrifty cooks transformed leftover crusts and dry heels into an economical but satisfying dish known as bread soup, proving once again that culinary magic often springs from limited options. Though it sounds deceptively basic, essentially bread soaked in broth or water, seasoned with whatever could be spared, this meal became an essential, accessible staple for struggling families nationwide. Remarkably affordable, it cleverly reduced waste by transforming scraps into something edible, ensuring nothing went to waste in the leanest of times. Some resourceful cooks even added leftover bits of vegetables or small meat pieces to elevate flavor and stretch nutritional value. Others opted for simplicity, seasoning their creations with nothing but salt, pepper, and perhaps a hopeful pinch of imagination. Historically, variations of this humble meal appeared globally, from European peasants' kitchens to early American pioneer tables, proving bread-based soups were universally recognized as thrifty comfort food. Even during the Great Depression, Americans couldn't imagine giving up their morning cup of joe. However, when coffee itself became an unaffordable luxury, families cleverly devised ways to stretch leftover grounds into a humble breakfast dish known as coffee soup. Though it might sound like something served by a distracted diner cook who accidentally spilled coffee into a bread basket, this inventive dish combined stale bread or crackers with watered-down coffee to create an inexpensive, filling meal. Rather than discarding leftover coffee, resourceful homemakers creatively transformed yesterday's brew into today's sustenance, cleverly maximizing resources at a time when waste was practically criminal. Often seasoned lightly with sugar, cinnamon, or sometimes even milk if available, this soup demonstrated the Depression-era art of making meals from nearly empty pantries. Interestingly, coffee soup wasn't new. It had European roots, brought by immigrants accustomed to transforming limited ingredients into hearty dishes. Yet, affordability trumped culinary preference. After all, old coffee was far more accessible than fresh eggs or bacon. At a time when salad dressing was considered extravagant and store-bought vegetables beyond budget, Depression-era kitchens turned to a clever dish called wilted lettuce salad, where simplicity met thrift. To stretch every penny further, families picked garden lettuce, an abundant and practically free resource, then poured hot bacon grease over the crisp greens, instantly transforming ordinary leaves into a surprisingly flavorful side dish. This method reduced kitchen waste by making excellent use of leftover bacon drippings stored carefully in jars beside stoves nationwide. Despite its unusual preparation, the wilted texture and salty, smoky taste became quite popular, even among those who typically turned up their noses at greens. Some diners humorously remarked it was the first salad they'd tasted that didn't feel too healthy, as the bacon fat probably outweighed any nutritional benefit the lettuce provided. This salad was especially practical since gardens often overflowed with leafy vegetables that otherwise would wilt beyond rescue. While it might raise eyebrows at modern dinner parties back then, wilted lettuce salad represented frugality at its finest, offering flavor on a shoestring budget. While fresh fruits vanished from American tables during the Great Depression, dried prunes remained steadfastly affordable, mostly because nobody ever fought for the last prune at the market. Enterprising cooks seized the opportunity, crafting a budget-friendly dessert known as prune pudding, cleverly sweetening dried prunes to deliver something resembling luxury. These dried fruits were widely accessible, inexpensive, and stored exceptionally well, making them perfect for frugal Depression-era pantries. Rather than toss out tough or stale bread, resourceful homemakers maximized resources by combining bread scraps, chopped prunes, and a dash of sugar into a dense but surprisingly satisfying pudding. Although its appearance left something to be desired, one diner amusingly compared its color to wet cement, The flavor often surpassed expectations, thanks to clever additions of cinnamon or nutmeg to brighten things up. This dish also appeared frequently in community cookbooks of the era, signaling its widespread acceptance despite occasional jokes about its digestive properties. Prune pudding wasn't glamorous, nor was it particularly crave-worthy, but it was certainly practical, a testament to Depression-era creativity, proving once again that necessity could transform humble pantry staples into meals worthy of respect. Few Depression-era dishes tested creativity quite like turning onions, the unsung heroes of frugal cooking, into an entire savory pie. Known humbly as Depression-era onion pie, this dish relied heavily on affordability and accessibility, leveraging one of the cheapest and most available vegetables of the time. Homemakers creatively layered thin slices of onion into a basic pie crust, seasoning generously with salt, pepper, and a touch of lard or bacon drippings saved from previous meals, cleverly maximizing kitchen resources. Without costly eggs or cream, cooks turned to humble pantry staples like flour and water, forming a thickened gravy to bind the onions into something surprisingly comforting. The result was hearty, economical, and, remarkably, often delicious enough to silence complaints at dinner tables across America. Of course, some joke that after eating onion pie, conversations became scarce due to lingering onion breath, but no one could deny it filled stomachs cheaply. An interesting fact is that variations of onion pies trace back centuries, with roots in European peasant cuisine, revealing how economic hardships revive older culinary traditions. In a period when fresh fruit was priced beyond reach and citrus marmalade felt like a distant luxury, creative Depression-era homemakers turned instead to humble garden carrots. The result was carrot marmalade, a clever culinary innovation that became a surprising pantry hero. Carrots were affordable, readily accessible, and packed with natural sweetness, which made them perfect candidates for preserving. Ingeniously, cooks combined grated carrots, sugar, and the zest of leftover citrus peels, brilliantly reducing kitchen waste, to create a marmalade that convincingly imitated pricier fruit jams. Some humorous cooks even bragged that it tasted exactly like orange marmalade, although taste buds might have respectfully disagreed. Historically, carrot marmalade recipes appeared in household cookbooks as early as World War I, but the Depression popularized this modest preserve, transforming humble carrots from humble side vegetables into breakfast table stars. Though today carrot marmalade might be considered a novelty rather than necessity, its significance remains undeniable. During the Great Depression, meat was an extravagance most families simply couldn't afford, so home cooks cleverly looked toward inexpensive pantry staples to provide necessary protein. Enter the humble beans and bread sandwich, affectionately called bean sandwiches, a budget-friendly meal that creatively transformed leftovers into hearty comfort food. Beans offered affordability and accessibility, especially dried beans which were abundant and economical to store. Frugal families regularly cooked large pots of beans, ensuring plenty of nutritious leftovers. Rather than waste even a spoonful, these resourceful cooks mashed leftover beans, seasoned them lightly, and generously spread the mixture onto slices of bread, often slightly stale but certainly still edible. Some cooks added onions, pickles, or relish to boost flavor, though kids humorously claimed that extra ingredients were only there to disguise the sandwich's true identity. Interestingly, bean-based sandwiches were a staple among miners and industrial workers even before the Depression, offering a quick, protein-rich meal on the go. Although this humble sandwich wasn't exactly gourmet, it successfully satisfied hungry stomachs without emptying wallets, becoming a mainstay of lunchboxes across America. When pantries echoed emptily during the Great Depression, flour and water could still offer salvation, often in the humble form of boiled flour dumplings. These straightforward dumplings, crafted from affordable ingredients, became essential to families struggling to keep everyone fed. Housewives ingeniously stretched scarce provisions by dropping spoonfuls of simple flour dough into simmering broths, thin soups, or just plain salted water, creating a filling meal from practically nothing. Though these dumplings lacked richness, often humorously described as flavor neutral, They provided affordability and accessibility unmatched by most other dishes of the era. Historically, variations of boiled dumplings have appeared in nearly every culture worldwide, proving this Depression-era staple was hardly original, yet perfectly timed for American kitchens facing unprecedented poverty. Cooks creatively enhanced the bland dumplings by adding leftover meat scraps, vegetable bits, or even kitchen herbs salvaged from their gardens, expertly maximizing resources. Amusingly, families joked that the dumplings doubled in size as they cooked, sometimes growing so large one might mistake them for floating pillows rather than food. As fresh milk became a luxury reserved for wealthier tables, Depression-era cooks turned to resourcefulness, whipping up humble yet nourishing alternatives, like the milkless potato soup. With pantries almost empty, families relied heavily on affordable staples such as potatoes, which provided sustenance at minimal cost. Potatoes weren't just cheap, they stored remarkably well, offering consistent accessibility even when other fresh ingredients were scarce. In preparing this soup, cooks creatively thickened the broth by thoroughly mashing boiled potatoes, creating a creamy texture that cleverly mimicked dairy without ever touching a drop of milk. Resourceful homemakers maximized flavor using leftover bacon drippings or small scraps of onion, subtly elevating the soup without increasing expenses. While traditional potato soups relied heavily on dairy for richness, Depression-era cooks creatively turned potato starch into the star ingredient, thickening broth into something resembling comfort food. Many families humorously referred to the soup as the dairy farmer's nightmare, acknowledging the conspicuous absence of milk in a dish typically known for its creaminess. In the Depression-era kitchen, potatoes weren't limited to savory dishes alone. They found their way into dessert too, with a creative confection known as Depression-era potato candy. Made primarily from mashed potatoes combined with powdered sugar, this surprising sweet treat cleverly showcased resourcefulness by utilizing leftover potatoes from dinner, reducing kitchen waste. Given that potatoes were incredibly affordable and easy to access, families frequently had them in abundance, allowing cooks to experiment with their culinary versatility. This unusual candy, which typically featured a filling of peanut butter or occasionally cinnamon, was rolled out, sliced into pinwheels, and chilled until firm. Remarkably, these simple candies tasted sweet enough to distract from the reality of empty pantries, though skeptical children joked that vegetables had officially infiltrated dessert territory. Despite its humble ingredients, this candy offered families a rare luxury in an otherwise stark period, proving once again that economic hardship could inspire true creativity. In Depression-era households, even traditional cooking methods became a luxury, prompting families to rediscover one of America's oldest culinary practices, preparing ash cakes. These humble cakes, crafted from nothing more than cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, were baked directly on hot fireplace ashes or embers, eliminating the need for expensive cookware or ovens. Affordability and accessibility defined the dish, as cornmeal was plentiful, cheap, and readily available even in the hardest-hit regions. With ingenuity driven by necessity, cooks carefully shaped patties from the simplest dough imaginable, then placed them directly onto the hot ashes, producing a warm, filling bread with a slightly smoky flavor. Though occasionally gritty from the ashes, leading some diners to humorously remark that it added extra minerals, the cakes effectively transformed scarcity into sustenance. Ash cakes were hardly new. Native Americans prepared similar breads centuries earlier, and pioneers relied on them as a convenient travel food. The Great Depression revived this traditional cooking style out of sheer practicality, providing nourishment without straining already stretched budgets. In a time when sandwiches filled with actual bacon were beyond budget, resourceful Depression-era cooks came up with a surprisingly practical alternative known as the bacon grease sandwich. Instead of discarding precious drippings from occasional bacon meals, frugal homemakers stored these leftover fats in jars, turning kitchen scraps into valuable pantry staples. Although bread slathered with rendered bacon fat might sound excessive today, it epitomized affordability and accessibility during the Depression, cleverly offering both calories and flavor without extra cost. Homemakers creatively seasoned these sandwiches with modest additions such as salt, pepper, or even garden-grown tomatoes, if available, transforming humble bread into something more satisfying. Many Depression-era children jokingly referred to their bacon grease sandwiches as invisible bacon, admitting that while the flavor was real, the meat itself remained a hopeful illusion. Historically, this practice of saving bacon drippings predates the Depression, stretching back generations as part of America's waste-not tradition. But the economic struggles of the 1930s dramatically boosted its popularity. Serving genuine chicken legs for dinner during the Depression often remained a fantasy, so home cooks creatively crafted a convincing substitute: mock chicken legs. Far more accessible than actual poultry, these affordable creations ingeniously stretched modest ingredients like ground pork, veal, or inexpensive sausage meat, which were molded around wooden skewers or popsicle sticks. After shaping, the faux drumsticks were breaded and fried, cleverly turning humble ingredients into a surprisingly satisfying imitation of real chicken. Reducing waste was central to this Depression-era recipe, as scraps of meat or stale breadcrumbs often found their way into the mixture, maximizing resources down to the last crumb. Ironically, there wasn't an ounce of chicken in these imitation legs, though children joked it tasted close enough as long as their eyes stayed closed. Interestingly, the concept behind mock chicken dishes dated back to World War I, when shortages inspired similar culinary illusions. Yet during the Depression, these pretend chicken legs became genuinely popular, appearing in home kitchens and even diner menus nationwide. Speedies are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Speedies set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Speedifests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. Boiled cactus pads, or as they're also called, no-pails. In the days when the pantry was bare and the garden was dust, people turned to the desert for dinner. To think that someone looked at a prickly cactus and thought, "Yep, let's eat that." Necessity is the mother of invention, and no-pails proved to be surprisingly edible and nutritious. The pads were stripped of their needles, carefully and boiled until tender, and had a tangy, almost lemony taste. They would chop them up, season them with whatever spices they had left, and serve them as a side dish. They were even thrown into stews, where their slimy texture acted as a natural thickener. It wasn't anyone's first choice, but when it came to survival, boiled cactus was a blessing in disguise. Fast forward to today, and no-pails are a delicacy in Mexican cuisine. During the Dust Bowl, they weren't about taste, they were about survival. Those desperate cooks never imagined what they saw as hardship food would one day be served in trendy restaurants. Cactus pads proved that even in hard times, resourcefulness can take ouch and turn it into yum. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. All right, let's talk about a real comfort food of the Depression: bean in tomato stew. Beans were a go-to ingredient during the Depression days because of how nutritious, affordable, and versatile they are. It's basically just what it sounds like: beans cooked in a tomato-based broth. But you could also throw in potatoes, carrots, and maybe even a little bit of rice for extra substance. The beans provided a good source of protein and fiber, while the tomato sauce added a burst of flavor. This stew could be enjoyed on its own or served over rice, bread, or even mashed potatoes if you were lucky enough to have them. Originally, Native Americans sweetened baked beans with maple syrup, but then someone decided to turn this protein into a stew, and hey, we're not complaining. It was a filling meal back in the day, and it's still cooked in many households around America where the budget is a bit too tight. I know this dish might sound plain, but believe me, when your belly is rumbling and your pantry is bare, this stew can be a lifesaver. Brown Betties were one of the most classic American desserts to ever grace the table of an American kid. Something that might be seen as an old-fashioned dessert now, but used to be the next best thing after an apple pie. The flavors of a Brown Betty usually come from the spiced apples and other fruit-layered dishes, which are really buttery. The sugary breadcrumbs on top give it a crunch, which really adds to the entire vibe of the Brown Betty. You're looking for a warm, comforting dish that gets you in a nostalgic mood. Something you can sit down with and enjoy bite for bite, not rush through. It's an experience that you want to savor, like an empty, windy street as you walk down by and enjoy it. The Brown Betty was definitely something that would get you up out into the street, whether you were going to visit your grandma's for an authentic pie or a nearby bakery to reminisce about childhood days. The earliest recipes you can find are the ones from 1866, but those are more like apple Betties than the ones we're talking about. Either way, this dish has definitely evolved alongside the population, and those who grew up with it will remember it fondly. If life hands you corn cobs, make jelly. This creation of the Dust Bowl is the best example of use it or else it will be used on you. Indeed, in the old days when food was hard to come by, one could not even discard corn cobs. Yes, the very same cobs that you discarded in the bin today were used to make a sweet golden jelly that was related to honey in taste. The process was simple. Take the cobs, boil them to get the corn starchy goodness, add sugar and pectin, and you have corncob jelly. It was inexpensive, convenient, and could be slathered on the constant companion of the Depression: bread. The taste? Light and sweet with a very subtle corn taste. And let's face it, when you are living off of crumbs, any type of jelly is a treat. Corncob jelly may not sound like a dish that could be eaten today, but during that period, it was the best invention to solve a real issue. Everyone wanted to get as much use out of every kernel of corn as was humanly possible, figuratively and literally. Now it is a recipe that one might find in a rustic fare or a book of curious recipes, but in the past, it was a true example of people's creativity. At the very least, corncob jelly makes us remember that life is a little sweeter when it's as corny as it is sweet. Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. Finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter. Up next, we have a dish that was all about making the most out of simple ingredients: spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole. It can be argued that Eleanor Roosevelt did the best she could during the Great Depression. The First Lady promoted dishes to encourage savvy homemakers, such as a casserole made from spaghetti, boiled carrots, and a simple white sauce of milk, flour, salt, and butter. The spaghetti had to be cooked for 25 minutes. The idea was to get the noodles mushy so they paired nicely with the boiled carrots and a penny's worth of creamy sauce. The result? A vehicle for nutrition and nutrients. Families loved this dish because it was versatile and could easily be modified based on what was available. It was a great way to fill up hungry bellies without breaking the bank. It still makes a pretty delicious meal for potlucks, so if you want to impress everyone with something easy to whip up, the spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole will do. You hear the name Rumaki and you might start thinking about some pretty exotic dishes, but it's actually more of a humble appetizer that picks a few flavors and does them really, really well. It was also made at Trader Vic's, a Polynesian-style restaurant right here in Uncle Sam's USA, which I'm sure you didn't see coming either. I wouldn't blame you for thinking it's exotic, since at tiki parties it was definitely considered that, and when tiki culture as a whole started erupting into the mainstream of American eating, it was still sought after, with just as much interest. The dish itself also makes use of some things that aren't familiar, and some that are, like chicken livers, water chestnuts, and bacon. It was a really good hors d'oeuvre that boomed in popularity after the World War II era, though you'd be pretty stumped if you tried to go out and look for it today. Still, it's kind of sad we can't go out to parties and experience chestnuts and crispy bacon anymore, wouldn't you agree? Or is tiki cooking not really up your alley? When life hands you a cow but almost nothing else, you cook the cow's brains. Fried cow brains, or calf's brains, if you want to sound a bit more gourmet, was a Dust Bowl specialty not because people wanted to eat it, but because they had to. They were not fastidious in the past. When you had to fight for your life, you ate everything that was on the animal. Now I know that fried cow brains may sound like something that shouldn't even be considered food, let alone something that might be considered delicious. For this dish, brains were washed in water or milk, dredged in flour, and fried until brown and crispy. Consider them as the first-generation chicken nuggets, if chicken nuggets had a soft core and came with a helping of angst. The flavor? It was mild, almost buttery, and that was the reason why nobody fled from the dish when somebody served it. Cow brains fried were dense in nutrients, especially protein, and thus a good meal during famine. While nowadays people might shudder at the thought of consuming brains, in the past, it was simply Tuesday's supper. And hey, if you put some gravy on top, it might just seem like you're eating gourmet food. Cornmeal mush is usually made with water or milk and is a type of pudding or porridge depending on the needs of the meal. This became incredibly widespread in the southeastern and eastern bits of America, and it makes sense given how much wartime rations were consumed there. When the government would hand those out, they would often make a point to lower sugar usage and use molasses to conserve other ingredients, so people would pair cornmeal mush along with them. Mush is a more accurate term since it does kind of land somewhere in the middle ground between a pudding and a porridge. It has the consistency of the latter, but it gels and sets like the former, which gives it a slightly airy texture too. Did you know it would not be cooked in milk though? That was set after the mush was prepared to cool it down. Okay, this one is a bit of a curveball. Cold milk soup? But hey, desperate times call for desperate measures. Cold milk soup was a Depression-era staple, and it's exactly what it sounds like. This dish has Amish origins and was one of the most popular meals back in the day. It was also pretty simple to whip up. Take some milk, mix in sliced bananas, a bit of sugar, and sometimes even bread or other fruits. And there you have it, cold milk soup. It might not sound like much, but for many families, this was a quick and easy way to get some calories and nutrients, especially when fresh ingredients were hard to come by. The bananas added some natural sweetness, while the milk provided protein and fat. It was a simple, no-cook meal that could be thrown together in minutes and was perfect for those hot summer days when turning on the stove was the last thing you wanted to do. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else. But Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical Southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies. And this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? If you are considering giving up Starbucks as a hardship, just try making your coffee out of these plants. Dandelion coffee came into existence during the Dust Bowl when people could not afford coffee beans and other products. That's right. Those yellow flowers that appear on your lawn in spring and are so annoying once provided the means to satisfy caffeine cravings at the survival level. For it, people would uproot dandelions, bake the roots until they were black and toasty, and then pulverize them into a brew. There was no sugar or cream, just the natural taste of roasted roots. It was not as strong as real coffee, but it provided people with something warm to drink in the mornings when they were unsure about the future. Moreover, dandelions were free and easily available. No need to go to Starbucks. To the chagrin of dandelion coffee, it is now considered a health drink. Rich in antioxidants, it is believed to have liver benefits and can be found at health food stores for a hefty price. It was not about the latest fad diet or the newest way to live a healthier lifestyle. It was about not going insane without your cup of coffee in the morning. I can't help but wonder how the farmers of Dust Bowl must have been feeling sipping on this dandelion brew and hoping for a better tomorrow and a decent cup of coffee. Now it is a retro chic beverage, while back then, dandelion coffee was a means of getting back to the normal, even if the normal tasted like the grass one mows. Oatmeal went out the window and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. Okay, this next one sounds like some kind of alien food, but Milkorno was a Depression-era kitchen miracle. It was a government-invented mixture of cornmeal and dried milk powder, designed to be a cheap and nutritious substitute for more expensive foods. A research team led by Flora Rose developed Milkorno, Milkowato, and Milkweedo cereals in the early 1930s, and they were sold exclusively to the Federal Emergency Relief Administration for distribution to Americans impoverished by the Depression. It was claimed that by substituting Milkorno for flour and cornmeal, a family of 5 could eat for less than $5 a week. The best part about Milkorno was its versatility. You could use it as a base for porridge, bake it into cornbread, or even use it to thicken soups. And while it might not sound super exciting, Milkorno dishes could actually be pretty tasty with the right seasonings and a bit of creativity. With the rise of delicious cereals, there's no room for it in our diets now, but hey, no one's going to judge you if you want to give it a try. We're going to go forward in time a bit, all the way to the beginning of what most people consider the late 20th century, where stuffed zucchini boats first started becoming something you would hear about regularly. You know, at bars, from your friends and colleagues, or your partners. They became really hot in the 60s and 70s when it felt like everyday people were trying another dish from a new country that hadn't really touched base in America yet. It was the first time people expanded their taste buds beyond the bacon, pancake, and hash brown breakfasts they were mostly used to. Plus, stuffed zucchini boats were really healthy. They were a lot better to eat than those aforementioned breakfasts. The best part was that you could really change up the fillings, so depending on what you wanted, you could have fully vegetarian zucchini boats or ones with ground beef stuffings. People say this is a part of Italian-American cooking, but a lot of Mediterranean cooking makes use of dishes similar to zucchini boats, like using stuffed peppers and vegetables like eggplants. Forget the meat aisle. What do you do when there's no meat? You make mock sausage. As you might have guessed, there was not exactly an abundance of food during the Dust Bowl era, so people started to experiment. The mock sausage was a mashup of anything remotely sausage adjacent. meals, flour, grains, breads, spices, and perhaps a little oil if you were fortunate. To make it, you would combine these simple ingredients into a paste, form it into patties similar to sausage, and then fry. The result? A breakfast sausage knockoff of sorts. But come on, nobody was ever deceived here. Nevertheless, the spices did their job, and in the worst of circumstances, one must do the worst of things. They ate mock sausage with whatever was available, bread, beans, or boiled greens, and it was a regular part of survival food. The mock sausage was not only about feeding people, but also about maintaining everyday life's appearance. It provided families an opportunity to consume something that at least resembled something they used to know. What is even more astonishing is how these recipes sustained spirits, and how it is possible for flavor not to disappear even when the ingredients have. Today, mock sausage is quite popular in the vegan and vegetarian community. But back then, it was about making a meal out of every single grain you had and ensuring that it was filling. This is what you can say about making the impossible possible. Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America. Next up, a dish that sounds almost too simple to be true: tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. I know, it doesn't exactly scream gourmet, but remember, we're talking about a time when people were just trying to survive. This combo was a way to stretch those precious few ingredients. During the Great Depression, potatoes were a cheap and filling staple, and tomato sauce was an easy way to add flavor. This dish was essentially a plate of creamy mashed potatoes topped with a savory tomato sauce. It might sound a bit unusual, but this combination was a hit because it was cheap, easy to make, and comforting. Plus, potatoes were versatile. You could mash them, fry them, or bake them depending on what you had. So, if you're ever in the mood for a simple yet tasty meal, try tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. Let's see if this humble dish can impress our modern taste buds. Now here's something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You can't ever beat a fried Bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of Bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried Bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. If you believe that using every part of the animal is a modern concept, you are mistaken. Dust Bowl families were not sparing any part of the pig, including the snout. Pig snouts breaded might sound like something you dare a friend to eat, but during the Great Depression, it was a delicacy. When meat was a rare commodity, the snout was a cheap source of something meaty, chewy, and quite palatable. The snouts were washed, cooked until soft, and then breaded before being deep-fried to golden brown. The result? A crispy outside and a very tasty meat on the inside. Well, yes, the texture may have been somewhat unusual, but when you are hungry, you don't mind. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. To Dust Bowl families, pig snouts breaded were not just edibles, but a way to pay tribute to every pound of what little they had. No part was wasted, while such meals ensured that scarcity became resourcefulness. Nowadays, breaded pig snouts can be found only in some culinary forums, but they are a vivid example of how people tried to feed themselves when there were no chips, but snouts. Would I try it? To put it in perspective, if my grandma was to prepare it with a wink and a smile, I'd be willing to take a bite. Indeed, when you survive, you become brave and perhaps a little curious. But would you try it? Leave us the answer in the comments below. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Here's a sandwich combo that might make you do a double take: peanut butter and mayo sandwich. Yes, you heard that right. Before PB and J sandwiches became a thing, peanut butter and mayo sandwiches was all the rage. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this one tastes far better than it sounds. In the 1930s, peanut butter and mayonnaise were both affordable and readily available, making them a popular pairing. The creamy, salty peanut butter mixed with the tangy mayo created a unique flavor combination that some people swear by to this day. It might sound strange, but remember, during the Great Depression, you ate what you could afford, and this sandwich was cheap and filling. So, if you're feeling brave and want to try something new, make yourself a peanut butter and mayo sandwich. Who knows, you might discover a new guilty pleasure. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. If you believe that eating insects is a modern, sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke. They were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by,